4 bogeys on my 6, closing fast. No wingman, low fuel, and command just ordered me to hold the line, no matter what. I'm Captain James Miller, call sign Phantom, and this wasn't how my Tuesday was supposed to go. What started as a routine patrol over the neutral zone quickly turned into something you only read about in history books. I've been flying for nearly 6 hours when radar lit up like a Christmas tree. They were coming in hot from the southeast, clearly hoping to breach our airspace before reinforcements could arrive. I was the only thing standing between them and our forward operating base, where 200 of our men were completely exposed. The sweat began to bead on my forehead as I banked hard right, pushing my F-35 to its limits. My hands weren't steady anymore, not after what happened last year when we lost Baker over the mountains. The memory still haunts me, his voice crackling over the radio as his systems failed one by one. I'd promised his wife I'd never let another pilot face those odds alone. Now here I was, outnumbered 4-1, with nothing but instinct and training to keep me alive. The sun was setting fast, casting long shadows across the terrain below, creating the perfect backdrop for an ambush. My radar warning receiver screamed as the first missile lock pinged. They'd spotted me and were spreading out into attack formation. Through my canopy, I could see their silhouettes now, sleek, nimble fighter jets designed for air superiority. They were faster than anything I'd trained against, but I knew their weakness. These pilots relied too heavily on their technology, on their numbers. They hadn't spent thousands of hours feeling their aircraft become an extension of themselves like I had. My commander's voice crackled through. "Phantom, you are clear to engage. Do whatever it takes." The familiar calm of combat focus washed over me as I flipped the safety cover off my weapon system. Time seemed to slow as I plotted my approach, calculating angles and energy states that would give me the slim advantage I needed. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. I thought about my daughter's birthday next week, the promise I'd made to be there this time. No retreat, no surrender, just survival and duty now. I pushed the throttle forward and climbed sharply into the setting sun, using its glare as cover. The enemy formation adjusted, exactly as I'd hoped they would. They were good, but predictable. Their lead fighter broke formation slightly, eager for the kill. That single mistake was all I needed, a tiny crack in their perfect coordination. As I rolled into my first aggressive maneuver, I knew the next 12 seconds would determine everything. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in the briefing rooms back home. The lead fighter came at me head-on, confident in his superior position. I could almost see the smirk behind his visor as he launched his first missile, a standard opening move. My threat warning blared in my ears, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I waited 3 precious seconds longer than most pilots would dare before deploying countermeasures and executing a high-G barrel roll that strained my flight suit to its limits. Blood rushed from my head as I pulled 9GS, fighting to stay conscious through the maneuver. The missile streaked past my wing, missing by meters, while I continued my roll directly into the enemy's blind spot. This wasn't in any training manual. It was something I'd developed after studying footage of Russian ace Mikhail Pugovian's legendary dogfights from the 2010s. My targeting system locked onto the lead fighter's exhaust. One press of the trigger, and my first missile was away, streaking toward its target before they could register my position. In these situations, you don't celebrate hits, there's no time. As the first enemy fighter erupted into a ball of flame, I was already calculating my next move. The remaining 3 bandits scattered, breaking their formation, exactly what I needed. They were communicating frantically now. I could tell by their erratic movement patterns. Confusion is a weapon more powerful than any missile when you're outnumbered. The second fighter tried to climb above me, seeking the high ground advantage that every pilot craves. Amateur move against an F-35. My thrust vectoring allowed me to pitch up at an angle his aircraft couldn't match. I remember feeling an eerie calm as I locked onto his fuel tank. These weren't just aircraft. They were men, pilots like me, with families waiting for them. But they had crossed into protected airspace with weapons hot. They had made their choice. My second missile found its mark, and another fireball lit up the darkening sky. 7 seconds had passed since the first engagement, and 2 enemies were down. The remaining pair split wide, trying to flank me from both sides, a classic pincer move that would have worked against most pilots. But I'd survived the Onbar Valley incident 2 years ago using a counter technique that nobody expected. I cut power and deployed air brakes simultaneously, causing an immediate and dramatic decrease in speed. The sudden deceleration caught them off guard, and one flew past my position, overshooting badly. In that split second, I had a perfect view of the pilot's helmet as he turned to track me, surprise visible even at that distance. He tried to bank away, but it was too late. I switched to guns. Missiles would take too long to arm at this range, and squeezed the trigger. The 25mm rounds tore through his canopy and engines. No explosion this time, just a silent, smoking descent as his aircraft spiraled toward the mountains below. No ejection seat deployed. 9 seconds had passed. 1 enemy remained, and he was now fully aware of what he was facing. I could see him hesitating, weighing his options. But retreat wasn't in his playbook either. He turned hard, bringing all his weapons to bear in one desperate, all-or-nothing attack. The last enemy pilot was good, better than the others. I could tell by how he handled his aircraft, keeping it on the edge of its performance envelope without crossing into unrecoverable territory. My radar showed he was a newer model, likely equipped with advanced countermeasures that would make conventional attacks ineffective. We circled each other like ancient warriors, each looking for that momentary lapse in the other's defense. My fuel warning light blinked insistently, a reminder that time wasn't on my side. If this engagement dragged on much longer, I'd be gliding back to base, assuming I made it back at all. The radio crackled with urgent messages from command, but I tuned them out. Nothing existed beyond this deadly dance. I fainted left, watching for his reaction. He didn't bite, instead responding with a countermove that nearly put him on my tail. This wasn't some rookie. Intelligence would later identify him as one of their decorated squadron leaders with over 2,000 combat hours. We were evenly matched in skill, but I had one advantage. I was fighting to protect something while he was merely following orders. I thought about the base behind me, the men and women who would have no warning if I failed here. Something changed in that moment, a clarity I'd never experienced before. I stopped trying to outfly him and instead focused on outthinking him. What would I expect if I were in his position? What would I never anticipate? The mountains below us created unusual wind patterns, powerful updrafts that most pilots avoid. I'd studied these formations for years during my deployment, often flying dangerously close to their peaks when weather permitted. With my fuel situation critical, I made a decision that went against every safety protocol in our handbook. I cut sharply toward the nearest mountain face, decreasing altitude in a dive that would appear suicidal to anyone watching. The enemy followed, sensing weakness, thinking I'd made a critical error. The G-forces pushed me back into my seat as I pulled up mere seconds before impact, using the powerful updraft from the mountain to slingshot my aircraft in an impossible arc. The maneuver strained every joint of my fighter, metal screaming in protest. My opponent wasn't prepared for the sudden wind shear. His aircraft wobbled for just a fraction of a second, but in aerial combat, fractions are all that separate life from death. I had already switched to my last heat-seeking missile, which locked onto his struggling engines instantly. 11 seconds had elapsed since the first engagement, and my missile streaked toward the final target with deadly precision. The explosion was almost beautiful against the purple twilight sky, a brief sun that expanded and then faded to smoke and falling debris. 12 seconds. For enemy aircraft destroyed. The skies were clear, and the warning call to our base was canceled before it even went out. As I turned my damaged fighter toward home, running on fumes and adrenaline, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. Not because the danger had passed, but because for those 12 seconds, I had found something most people search for their entire lives: absolute certainty of purpose. The flight back to base was the longest 20 minutes of my life. My aircraft had taken damage during the engagement. Nothing critical, but enough to make every slight turbulence feel like a potential catastrophe. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me exhausted and hyper-aware of how close I'd come to not making this return journey. My fuel gauge hovered just above empty, forcing me to glide more than fly, catching thermal currents to extend my range. Through my canopy, I could see the first stars appearing, indifferent to the battle that had just unfolded beneath them. It's strange how the universe continues its routine while we fight our desperate struggles thousands of feet above the earth. Radio contact with base had been re-established, and I could hear the disbelief in the controller's voice as she guided me home. Phantom, we're showing 4 confirmed kills on radar. Please verify. I almost laughed at the formal request, as if there might have been some other explanation for what had just happened. Verified was all I could manage, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Word was spreading fast. By the time the runway lights came into view, I could see unusual activity below. Vehicles moving, people gathering. This wasn't the standard reception for a returning patrol. My landing gear deployed smoothly despite the damage. Small mercies in a day that had offered few. The wheels touched down with a squeal that echoed across the suddenly quiet base. As I taxied toward the hangar, I saw them. The entire squadron lined up alongside maintenance crews, intelligence officers, even the base commander. This wasn't protocol. This was something else entirely. My canopy opened to applause, a sound so unexpected that for a moment I thought something was wrong with my aircraft. Hands reached up to help me down, clapping my shoulders, steadying me when my legs proved less reliable than I'd hoped. The squadron commander, Colonel Richards, pushed through the crowd with an expression I couldn't quite read. For aircraft in 12 seconds, he said, not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. The intelligence officer beside him was already reviewing footage captured by my aircraft systems, shaking his head in disbelief. They debriefed me right there on the tarmac, breaking every procedure in the manual. The engagement hadn't just been significant. It had potentially prevented a major incursion that our intel hadn't seen coming. The 4 aircraft I'd encountered were just the advance force, sent to neutralize our air defenses before a larger operation. By stopping them, I triggered a reassessment on their side, buying critical time for reinforcements to arrive. Someone pressed a satellite phone into my hand. The general himself was calling from Central Command. As I listened to his words of commendation, I watched a new squadron of our fighters launching into the darkening sky, heading to replace the line I'd held alone. They climbed in perfect formation, contrails cutting across the stars like signatures. And I realized something that would stay with me through everything that followed. Sometimes victory isn't about the enemy you defeat, but about what you protect. The next morning arrived with a surreal quality, like waking up in someone else's life. Word of the engagement had traveled far beyond our base. Apparently, satellite coverage had captured portions of the dogfight, and the footage was causing quite a stir up the chain of command. I was summoned to the briefing room, still sore from the high-G maneuvers and lack of sleep. Walking through the base was an odd experience. Conversations stopped as I passed, replaced by nods of respect or quiet congratulations. Fame, even the limited variety found within military circles, was never something I'd sought or particularly wanted. I'd always believed a pilot's best work should speak for itself, without need for recognition or ceremony. The briefing room fell silent when I entered, filled beyond capacity with intelligence officers, squadron leaders, and faces I didn't recognize, some in uniforms indicating they'd flown in specifically for this meeting. The wall screen displayed multiple angles of yesterday's engagement, some from my aircraft's cameras, others from distant observation posts and satellites. Seeing it from the outside was disorienting. The maneuvers looked more reckless, more impossible than they had felt in the moment. Colonel Richards stood to address the room, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by something I rarely saw, genuine amazement. What Captain Miller accomplished yesterday wasn't just textbook, he began, because there's no textbook for what he did. 4 confirmed kills in 12 seconds, while outnumbered and low on fuel, isn't just a record. It's a revelation in aerial combat tactics. What followed was less a debriefing and more a detailed dissection of every decision I'd made, every maneuver I'd executed. Intelligence had identified the enemy aircraft as next-generation fighters with capabilities that should have given them an overwhelming advantage. The lead pilot had been their equivalent of an ace, with multiple kills to his name. Technical analysts were particularly interested in my use of the mountain updrafts. Apparently, no one had successfully weaponized natural terrain features in that way before. "We'll be studying this engagement for years," the Air Combat Command representative said. "Possibly decades." I answered their questions mechanically, trying to articulate the instinctive calculations that had guided my actions. How do you explain that in those moments, you become something beyond yourself? A perfect fusion of man and machine. The base commander stepped forward last, holding a small box that immediately silenced the room. Inside was a distinguished flying cross, one of the highest honors a pilot can receive. This came directly from the Pentagon, with expedited processing I've never seen before, he explained. As he pinned it to my flight suit, cameras flashed, documenting a moment that would soon appear in military publications worldwide. I thought about how strange valor recognitions are, how they try to encapsulate life-or-death moments in small pieces of metal and ribbon. Later that day, I received permission to call home. My daughter's voice was excited, confused by the special call outside our normal schedule. "Daddy did something important at work," was all I could think to say. "I'll tell you about it at your birthday." How do you explain to a 7-year-old what it means to take lives to save others? That was the question weighing on me as I walked across the sunlit tarmac toward my aircraft, now repaired and ready for the next mission. That night, alone in my quarters, the adrenaline completely gone, the weight of what had happened finally hit me. For pilots, gone. In the heat of combat, there's no time to consider what you're really doing, who you're really fighting. They become targets, threats, problems to solve with split-second decisions and perfect execution. It's only later, in the quiet darkness, that they become people again. Men with families, with dreams, with their own sense of duty that led them to that same airspace. I sat on the edge of my bunk, turning the distinguished flying cross over in my hands, feeling a heaviness that no briefing room celebration could dispel. Military psychologists have a term for this. They call it moral injury, but no clinical language can really capture what it feels like to excel at taking human life. Sleep wouldn't come, so I found myself walking the perimeter of the airfield in the early hours, watching as maintenance crews prepared aircraft for the day's missions. One of our oldest mechanics, Sergeant Hayes, was inspecting my fighter by flashlight, running his hands over the recently repaired sections with the care of a parent checking a child for fever. He didn't seem surprised to see me there. "First time breaking the 4 barrier?" he asked without looking up. I nodded, though he couldn't see it in the darkness. Had a pilot back in Desert Storm who took out 3 in under a minute. Never flew the same afterward, said the sky felt different to him. He finally turned to face me, his weathered face illuminated by the flashlight. "The ones worth keeping are the ones who feel it, Captain." His words stayed with me as dawn broke across the base, painting the mountains where yesterday's engagement had unfolded in soft pink light. At breakfast, my squadron mates gave me space, not out of disrespect but from understanding. They'd seen the toll that combat takes, how victory and trauma are often indistinguishable in the early hours after. Major Williams, our squadron's most experienced pilot, finally sat down across from me, sliding a cup of coffee in my direction. "Command wants to rush you to headquarters for a press conference," he said without preamble. I told them you needed 48 hours minimum. They didn't like it, but they agreed. I thanked him with a nod, grateful for the buffer. The military's need for heroes often outpaces a human's ability to process becoming one. Later that morning, I received unexpected permission to video call my family. My wife's face appeared on screen, concern evident despite her smile. She knew me well enough to see beyond the victory to the cost. Our daughter bounced in a frame, happily oblivious, chattering about school and her upcoming birthday party. Watching her, I felt something unlock inside, a reminder of why yesterday's decisions had been necessary. Not for medals or records or even duty in the abstract, but for very concrete futures, birthdays and graduations, first loves and careers, all the moments that make a life worth protecting. When the call ended, I walked to the flight line where my fighter waited for the afternoon patrol. The maintenance crew had painted 4 small stars beneath the canopy, unofficial kill markings that would likely be removed before any media appearances. I ran my hand over them, feeling the slight texture against my fingertips. Each represented a life, yes, but also hundreds of lives preserved. The intelligence gathered from my encounter changed everything about our operational approach. 3 days after the engagement, I was called into a classified briefing with Joint Forces Command representatives. The room was secured beyond normal protocols, with electronic countermeasures active and guards posted outside. Whatever they were about to share went well beyond the usual operational information. The lead analyst, a civilian with the intense focus that marks those who've spent too many years studying conflict patterns, activated a holographic display showing dozens of aircraft movements across the region. "Captain Miller," she began, "your encounter wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern we've been tracking for months, a new combat doctrine they've been developing specifically to counter our air superiority." The display zoomed in on flight paths similar to those of the 4 aircraft I'd engaged. Their approach relies on overwhelming numbers and technological advantage, qualities they believed we couldn't counter without matching numbers. She paused, a rare smile crossing her usually stoic features. "What you demonstrated was that superior training and tactical innovation can negate both those advantages." The Joint Chiefs had apparently reviewed my engagement multiple times, focusing particularly on the terrain utilization and energy management techniques I'd employed. They weren't just impressed. They were rewriting entire sections of the combat doctrine based on what they'd observed. My improvised tactics were being formalized into training protocols that would be implemented across all fighter squadrons within a month. What struck me most was how thoroughly they'd analyzed every millisecond of the encounter. Engineers had calculated the precise angles of my approaches, the exact timing of my weapons deployment, even the fuel consumption rates during critical maneuvers. Nothing about combat feels scientific when you're in the middle of it. It's instinct, training, and sometimes pure desperation. Yet here were physicists and tactical analysts reducing those life-or-death moments to equations and reproducible techniques. Colonel Richards noticed my expression and leaned in while the presentation continued. "This is how progress happens," he said quietly. "One pilot pushes the boundaries, and we all learn from it. You just advanced air combat tactics by about 5 years in 12 seconds. The briefing concluded with the reveal of a new training program, one I was being asked to help develop back at the Air Warfare Center. They wanted me to work with their best pilots, teaching them to replicate what had come to me instinctively in that desperate moment. It was an honor, of course, but also a profound responsibility. Lives would depend on how well I could translate experience into instruction. As we filed out of the secure room, my squadron commander handed me transfer orders already signed and expedited. "They're not giving us a choice on this one, Miller," he said with a mix of pride and resignation. "You've become too valuable as an instructor to risk on regular patrols." That night, I walked one last time around my fighter, memorizing every line and curve of the aircraft that had become an extension of myself over countless missions. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter, teaching others to survive what I'd barely survived myself. 6 months after that fateful encounter, I stood before 24 of our military's most promising pilots at the Advanced Tactics School. The simulator room hummed with the sound of cooling fans and expectant silence as these young aviators, each already exceptional by normal standards, waited for me to share the insights that had brought them here. The wall behind me displayed the now famous footage of my 12-second engagement, alongside the complex analysis that had followed. I'd given this presentation numerous times now, but it never became routine. How do you teach someone to perform at the very edge of human capability? How do you prepare them for moments when everything, their training, their aircraft, their very survival instinct will be pushed beyond design limits? Forget everything you think you know about numerical disadvantage. I began, watching their reactions closely. The tactics I'm going to show you aren't about how to fight when outnumbered, They're about how to change the nature of the engagement so that numbers become irrelevant. Over the next 3 hours, I broke down every decision, every maneuver from those 12 seconds, explaining not just what I did, but why I did it. The mount and updraft technique had been formally named the Miller Vertical Assist in the updated combat manual, a surreal honor that still made me uncomfortable. More importantly, pilots were already successfully implementing these approaches in exercises, achieving victory ratios that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. What had been born from desperate improvisation was evolving into refined doctrine. Between training sessions, I worked with engineers who were modifying our aircraft systems to better support these new tactics. Small changes to alert systems, slight adjustments to control responsiveness. Details that might seem insignificant on paper, but could mean everything when split seconds determine survival. The lead engineer, Dr. Harlow, had become something of a friend during our long hours in the lab. "You know what makes your approach so revolutionary?" she asked one evening as we reviewed simulator data. "It's not just about the technology or even the technique. It's the mindset. You stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about advantage, even when conventional wisdom said there was none to be found." Her observation stuck with me, revealing something about that day I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. As the training program expanded to international allies, I received word that my old squadron had successfully implemented the new tactics in a recent border engagement. No losses, mission accomplished, the kind of report every commander hopes to read. My replacement, Captain Chun, had apparently used the mountain technique to evade multiple hostiles while completing a critical reconnaissance run. The continuity meant more to me than any medal or recognition. This wasn't about individual achievement anymore, but about a lasting contribution to how we protect our skies and the people beneath them. On the rare weekends I made it home, my daughter would sometimes ask me to tell her about my special mission. I never shared the combat details, focusing instead on the teamwork, the important job of keeping people safe. Sometimes I told her one person in the right place at the right time can change everything. She seemed to understand this better than many adults.